Sometimes the worst crime a man can commit is being seen at the wrong moment. The river roared like it had a mind of its own, swollen from 3 days of hard rain, churning mud and broken branches through a canyon that didn't forgive mistakes. Ethan Cole hit the bank on one knee, lungs burning, water streaming from the brim of his hat, his fingers still locked around a fistful of torn fabric that shouldn't have been in his hand. Behind him, the woman he had dragged out of that current, Ayanna Redbird, stumbled backward across the wet stones, clutching what remained of her dress to her chest, her breath uneven, her eyes wide but not with relief. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. In Ethan's world, pulling someone out of a river meant you were the good man in the story. Out here, something in her gaze said he had just crossed a line he couldn't see. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and cedar smoke down from the ridge above, and Ethan felt it before he heard it, the presence of eyes. He looked up slowly. Shapes stood along the high ground, still as carved stone, watching the scene below with a silence that pressed against his chest harder than the river ever had. From where they stood, the truth had been reduced to a single image, a white rancher standing too close, a native woman retreating, torn cloth in his hand like proof already decided. Ayanna's voice came fast, low, urgent in a language he didn't understand, her hands moving in small, controlled gestures that weren't meant for him. Then she switched, just enough English to cut through the noise of the water. "You have to leave." Ethan didn't move. His boots were planted in mud, and something heavier than that. "You were drowning," he said, like the words might fix what the moment had broken. She shook her head once, sharp, almost angry, not at him, but at the time slipping away. "They will not see that." The first sound rolled down from the ridge then, not loud, not chaotic, but deliberate, a call that carried weight. Figures began to descend, one after another, moving with a certainty that came from knowing the land belonged to them. Ethan's hand drifted near his holster out of habit, then stopped halfway. There were too many. 10, maybe more, and more shadows forming behind them. This wasn't a standoff he could win. It wasn't even one he could fight. Ayanna stepped closer for a heartbeat, close enough that he could see the fine tremor in her hands despite the steadiness of her voice. "If you stay, they will judge what they think they saw." The word judge hung there, heavier than any threat. Ethan looked past her at the men closing the distance, their pace unhurried, their eyes fixed, not wild, not reckless, just certain. He opened his hand slowly and looked down at the torn cloth, darkened with river water, the one piece of truth that now looked like a lie. He let it hang between his fingers. The river kept moving behind him, uncaring, carrying branches and debris downstream, like nothing that happened here would matter in an hour. But it did matter. It mattered in the way the air tightened, in the way the approaching men said nothing, in the way Ayanna stepped aside, not abandoning him, not protecting him, just making space for what was coming. Ethan took a slow breath, tasting mud and rain, and chose not to run. The first man reached the water without a sound, boots sinking half an inch into the mud before stopping, his presence alone shifting the weight of the air. He did not raise a weapon. He did not need to. The others spread behind him in a loose arc, careful, measured, like men who understood that control was stronger than noise. Ethan stood where he was, hands open at his sides, not raised in surrender, not clenched in defiance, just there, as if the truth might recognize him if he did not move. The leader's eyes passed over the river, the torn cloth, the distance between Ethan and Ayanna, and settled on the only detail that mattered to him. Evidence did not speak. It simply existed. Ayanna felt it too, the way judgment formed without words, the way a story could be written before anyone asked what really happened. She took a breath, slow and quiet, remembering something her grandmother once told her, that silence could protect or destroy depending on when it was used. She had seconds left to decide which one this would be. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the wet leather of his boots creaking just enough to draw attention, and that small sound felt louder than the river. Every gaze turned sharper. Every assumption tightened. He looked at the leader, not challenging, not pleading, just meeting his eyes like a man who had already accepted the outcome but refused to hide from it. "She was in the current," he said again, voice steady, carrying just far enough. The words fell flat against the space between them. No one answered. The leader stepped closer, close enough now that Ethan could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from years of watching men make mistakes. His hand moved, not toward a weapon, but toward the torn fabric still hanging from Ethan's fingers. He did not take it. He simply looked at it, then at Ayanna. The question was not spoken, but it was clear. Ayanna felt every eye turned to her, felt the weight of her people, their history, their rules, pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel Ethan behind that weight too, not as a savior, not as a stranger, just as a man caught between worlds that did not share the same meaning for the same act. She stepped forward once, then stopped, the mud pulling lightly at her boots, grounding her in a moment that would not repeat. Her voice did not come immediately. It waited, measured, controlled. "You saw only the end," she said finally, her English careful, each word placed like it mattered. The leader did not respond, but something in his posture shifted, a fraction, enough to say he was listening. Ethan did not look at her. He kept his eyes forward, giving her the space to speak without interference, understanding in some quiet way that anything he added now would only make it worse. The river moved behind them, steady, indifferent, carrying away branches, leaves, and everything that could not hold its ground. Ayanna lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, but in clarity. "The water took me," she continued, her voice stronger now, not loud, but certain. "He did not." The words settled into the space like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the circle of men who had arrived ready to believe something else. No one spoke. No one needed to. The leader held her gaze for a long moment, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that would break the line she had drawn. He did not find it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders eased. Not an apology, not an agreement, just in recognition that the story had changed. One of the men behind him shifted his stance, the tension leaving his arms first, then another, and another, like a quiet decision passing through them without command. Ethan felt it before he saw it, the way the air loosened, the way the moment stepped back from the edge it had been holding. The leader finally turned his head slightly, a signal so small it could have been missed, and the circle opened, not all at once, but enough to show that it no longer held him in place. No one offered words. No one asked for more. Out here, truth did not need to be explained twice. Ethan exhaled slowly, not relief, not yet, just the release of a breath he had been holding since the river. Ayanna did not look at him, not because she could not, but because some distances were not meant to be closed in a single moment. The leader took one last look at the cloth, now hanging useless and empty, then turned away from it completely, as if what it had meant a minute ago no longer existed. The others followed, one by one, their steps quiet, their presence fading back into the land as if they had never been there at all, leaving behind only the sound of water and the space where judgment had almost taken hold but did not. The river kept moving as if nothing had happened, dragging broken branches past the stones where Ethan still stood, his boots sunk just enough to remind him he was still there, still part of something he did not fully understand. The last of the warriors disappeared beyond the ridge without looking back, their presence fading into the land the same way it had arrived, quiet and certain, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the moment before. Ethan did not reach for his gun. He did not move toward the path. He just stood there, watching the place where they had been, as if the truth might still be lingering in the air they left behind. Ayanna remained a few steps away, her posture steady, her eyes no longer searching the ridge but fixed somewhere lower, somewhere closer to the ground between them. The torn edge of her dress shifted slightly in the breeze, and for a moment that small detail carried more weight than anything either of them could say. Ethan finally let the fabric fall from his hand. It dropped into the shallow water and began to drift, slow at first, then caught by the current, turning, folding, disappearing into something that did not hold on to what it carried. He watched it go until it was gone. "I did not know," he said quietly, not as an excuse, not as a defense, just a statement that arrived too late to matter. Ayanna lifted her gaze then, meeting his eyes for the first time since the circle had broken. There was no anger in it now, no fear either, just something measured, something that weighed more than the moment itself. "You knew what your world taught you," she replied, her voice calm, almost even. "That is not the same as knowing this one." The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of sage from somewhere higher up the canyon. Ethan nodded once, slow, absorbing the distance between those two ideas, understanding that the space between them was wider than the river he had just crossed. He glanced toward the ridge, then back at her. They believed what they saw, he said. That is how it works out here, she answered. Seeing is enough. Until it is not. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a quiet certainty that came from living inside that truth for longer than he could measure. Ethan took a step back from the water, the mud releasing his boot with a soft pull, as if even the ground had decided to let him go. He looked around then, really looked, at the canyon walls, the scattered stones, the path that led out and away. And for the first time it felt different, not hostile, not welcoming, just real in a way it had not been before. You could have said nothing, he said after a moment. Ayana's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of something deeper than the surface calm. She carried. Silence is not always protection, she said. Sometimes it is the same as a lie. The words settled between them, simple, but carrying the weight of what had almost happened. Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, slower this time, steadier. Then I owe you more than thanks, he said. Ayana shook her head once, not dismissing him, but correcting the direction of the thought. You owe the truth, she replied. That is all. The river moved behind them, steady, unchanged, but the space between them no longer felt like something that needed to be crossed. It simply existed, understood, acknowledged. Ethan adjusted his hat slightly, the brim still damp, the leather band darkened from the water, and gave a small nod that carried more meaning than words would have. He turned then, not toward her, but toward the path that led back through the canyon. Each step measured, deliberate, like a man learning how to walk through a place he thought he already knew. Ayana watched him go for a moment, her gaze following not the man himself, but the way he carried what had just happened, the way he did not look back, not out of pride, but out of understanding that some moments did not need to be revisited to be remembered. When he disappeared beyond the bend, she turned back to the river, kneeling briefly at its edge, her fingers brushing the surface where the current had taken the last piece of what had almost become a different story, and for a moment, the water reflected nothing at all. By the time Ethan reached the narrow trail that cut through the canyon wall, the sound of the river had softened behind him, replaced by the dry whisper of wind moving through scrub and stone, but something in him had not quieted, not yet, not fully, because the kind of silence he carried now was not the absence of danger, it was the presence of understanding, and that weighed more than any threat he had faced standing in that water. His horse stood where he had left it, tied loosely to a bent cedar branch, ears flicking at his approach, as if the animal sensed the change before Ethan could name it himself. He rested a hand against the horse's neck for a moment, feeling the warmth under damp skin, grounding himself in something familiar, something that did not question him, did not judge what it saw. But even that felt different now. He untied the reins slowly, his movements deliberate, like a man measuring each action against something new, something unspoken. As he swung into the saddle, he glanced once back toward the river, though he could no longer see it, only the bend of land where it disappeared, and for a brief second, he wondered how many moments like that had been lost out here, misunderstood, decided too quickly, carried away like that strip of fabric. The trail ahead stretched for nearly half a mile before it widened into open land, leading back toward his ranch, a place that had always felt like his own small claim on the world. Today, it felt smaller, not weaker, just less certain. He rode at an easy pace, letting the horse choose its footing along the uneven ground, while his mind replayed the moment in pieces, not as one story, but as fragments that refused to line up the way he had expected. Her voice, the leader's eyes, the way no one asked for more than what was said, the way truth, once spoken, did not need defending. It was not like the towns he had passed through before, where men argued until words lost meaning. Out here, meaning came first. Words followed. The sun had begun to break through the clouds by the time he reached the open stretch, light spilling across the land in long, pale lines that made everything look sharper, clearer, like the world had been washed clean by the storm. But clarity had a cost. He saw his ranch in the distance then, No more than a few structures against the wide stretch of earth, smoke curling lightly from the chimney, a sign that life continued as it always had. Yet something in him hesitated before he urged the horse forward. Not fear, not doubt, just a pause, as if stepping back into that space required him to carry something with him that he did not have before. When he finally reached the fence line, he dismounted slowly, boots hitting the dry ground with a dull thud, and stood there for a moment, looking at the worn wood, the familiar gait, the marks left by years of use. Everything looked the same. That was the problem. He walked toward the porch, each step steady, but heavier than it should have been, and pushed the door open without knocking, the hinges creaking in the same way they always did, a sound that once meant home and now felt like a reminder of how little he had questioned the world beyond it. Inside, the air was still, carrying the faint smell of coffee and old wood, the table where he had sat every morning waiting just as he left it. He set his hat down slowly, the damp brim leaving a faint mark on the surface, and stood there, hands resting against the edge, staring at nothing in particular. Then, after a long moment, he reached for a small tin cup, filled it with water, and paused before taking a drink. His reflection wavered in the surface, distorted, shifting, like something that had not yet settled into place. He lowered the cup without drinking. Outside, the wind moved across the open land, steady, quiet, carrying no voices, no judgment, just the same world he had known his entire life. But Ethan Cole understood something now that he had not understood that morning. Out here, a man could do everything right and still be wrong in the eyes of another world. And the only thing that could bridge that distance was not strength, not speed, not even intention. It was the willingness to stand still long enough to be seen clearly. He stepped back from the table, leaving the water untouched, and walked to the doorway again, looking out across the land as if he were seeing it for the first time, knowing without saying it aloud that the next time he crossed that canyon, he would not be the same man who rode into it. The afternoon settled slowly over the ranch, the kind of quiet that usually brought comfort, now carrying a weight Ethan could not set down, no matter where he stood or what he touched. He moved through the small space of his home without purpose at first, his hands brushing against familiar things like they might answer questions he had not learned how to ask yet. The chair by the window, the worn edge of the table, the rifle resting above the doorway, untouched, as if even it understood. That today had not been about force. Outside, the sky had cleared completely, stretching wide and open in that endless way that used to make him feel certain about his place in it. Now it only reminded him how much of it he had never truly seen. He stepped back out onto the porch, the wood creaking under his boots, and leaned one shoulder against the post, eyes fixed on the horizon where the land met the sky in a thin, unbroken line. Somewhere beyond that line was the canyon. Somewhere beyond that was a world that had judged him in a single glance and then, just as quickly, chosen not to. That part stayed with him more than anything else. Not the danger, not the fear, but the moment they decided to walk away. Ethan ran a hand along the back of his neck, feeling the dried trace of river water still clinging to his skin, and let out a slow breath that did not quite feel like relief. "You stand still long enough," he murmured to himself, the words low, almost lost to the wind, "and the truth has to decide what to do with you." He did not know where that thought came from, only that it felt right in a way nothing else had since morning. The sound of hooves reached him a few minutes later, distant at first, then steady, approaching from the direction he had come. Ethan straightened, his body responding before his mind had time to follow, and stepped down from the porch, boots hitting the dirt with quiet certainty. He did not reach for his gun. He did not need to. When the rider came into view, it was not a group this time. Just one figure moving at an even pace, posture upright, gaze fixed ahead like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Ayanna. She reined in her horse a few yards from the fence, not crossing it, not calling out, simply waiting. Ethan stopped where he was, the distance between them deliberate, understood. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry scent of dust and sun-warmed earth, a different world from the river, but tied to it all the same. "You came a long way for silence," Ethan said finally, his voice calm, not questioning, just acknowledging what stood in front of him. Ayanna's expression did not shift, but her eyes held something deeper than before, something that had not been there by the river. Silence is not always the end of a story, she replied. Ethan gave a slight nod, accepting that without needing more. Then what is this? He asked. Ayanna reached into the small pouch at her side and drew out something wrapped in cloth, worn but carefully kept, the edges darkened with time and use. She held it for a moment, then extended it across the fence, not stepping closer, leaving the choice to him. Ethan approached slowly, each step measured, until he stood close enough to see the fine stitching in the fabric, the kind that took patience, not haste. He took it with both hands, respectful without thinking about why, and unwrapped it just enough to see what lay inside. A small piece of silver, shaped simply, but marked with symbols he did not recognize. It caught the light in a quiet way, not shining, just present. Ethan looked up, confusion clear but restrained. What is it? He asked. Ayanna watched him for a long moment before answering. Something that tells the truth when words cannot, she said. The weight of that settled into his hands, heavier than the metal should have been. He closed the cloth carefully around it, holding it like it mattered, because somehow he understood that it did. And you are giving this to me? He asked. Ayanna shook her head once, her voice steady. I am trusting you with it. Ethan stood there, the wind moving past him, the open land stretching behind, and felt that same quiet shift inside him again, the one that had started at the river but had not finished yet. He looked at her, really looked this time, not as someone from another world, but as someone who had chosen to step into his. Then I will carry it the right way, he said. Ayanna held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that was all she had come to hear. She turned her horse without another word, guiding it back toward the open land, leaving Ethan standing by the fence with something in his hands that did not belong to him, but had found its way there anyway. The dust had not settled by the time Ayanna disappeared over the rise, not because the land held on to her presence, but because something in Ethan refused to let the moment close as easily as it had opened. He remained by the fence longer than he needed to, the small wrapped object resting in his palm, its weight unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with size. It was not heavy, not in ounces, but it carried something else, something he could not measure, something that pressed quietly against his thoughts like a question waiting to be answered. He turned it over once in his hand, feeling the edges through the cloth, then tucked it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat, not out of caution, but out of respect he had not realized he understood until now. The wind moved across the open land again, steady and dry, carrying no trace of the river, no trace of her voice, only the wide silence of a place that did not explain itself to anyone. Ethan stepped back from the fence and walked toward the barn, each step deliberate, not hurried, as if the ground itself had become something to pay attention to. Inside, the air was cooler, shadowed, the scent of hay and leather grounding him in something solid, something unchanged. His horse shifted slightly in its stall, turning its head toward him with a low, quiet sound that asked nothing and expected nothing. Ethan reached up and ran a hand along the animal's neck, slow, steady, letting the rhythm settle his thoughts for a moment. But the quiet did not last. It never did when something important had already begun. He stepped back, leaned against the wooden beam, and let his eyes rest on the open doorway where the light cut across the floor in a sharp line. Something that tells the truth when words cannot. He repeated under his breath, the phrase lingering longer than it should have. He had heard men talk about truth his whole life. In towns, in deals, around tables where voices got louder the less certain they became. But this felt different. This felt like truth did not belong to the man who spoke it. It belonged to something else entirely. A sound reached him then, faint but familiar, not from the distance this time, but from closer than expected. Hoofbeats again. Slower. Not urgent. Ethan straightened, his body reacting before his thoughts formed, and stepped back out into the light. The rider approaching now was not Ayanna. The man sat taller in the saddle, older, his presence carrying the same quiet control Ethan had seen by the river, but with something added, something that felt like time itself had shaped it. The horse stopped just short of the fence, the man not crossing, not asking, simply waiting. Ethan recognized what that meant now. Permission was not taken here. It was given. Ethan stepped forward once, enough to close the distance without closing the space. You came from the canyon, he said, Not a question, just a statement. The man inclined his head slightly, his gaze steady, assessing, not hostile, not welcoming, simply aware. And you came back from it, the man replied, his voice low, even, carrying no judgment, only recognition. Ethan nodded once. That was enough. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved between them, lifting small strands of dust, carrying the faint scent of sage once more. The man's eyes shifted briefly, not to Ethan, but to the space where his coat lay, as if he could see through it, as if he already knew. She brought you something, the man said. Ethan did not reach for it. He did not need to. She said it tells the truth, he answered. The man studied him for a moment longer, then gave a slow, measured nod. It does not tell the truth, he said. It shows whether you can carry it. The words landed quietly, but they settled deeper than anything Ethan had heard that day. He held the man's gaze, understanding just enough to know there was more beneath it. And if I cannot? Ethan asked. The man's expression did not change. Then it will not stay with you, he replied. No threat, no warning, just a simple statement of how things were. Ethan let that sit, felt the weight of it, not in his pocket, but somewhere else entirely. The man turned his horse slightly then, as if the purpose of his visit had already been fulfilled. Out here, he added, glancing once toward the open land. A man is not judged by what he says happened. He is judged by what remains. After. Ethan watched him, the meaning not fully clear, but enough to stay. And what remains? He asked. The man paused, just long enough to let the question exist. That depends on whether you are still standing when no one is watching, he said. Then he nudged his horse forward, riding back the way he came, leaving Ethan alone once more with the open land, the quiet wind, and something in his pocket that was no longer just an object, but a measure of something he had not yet proven he understood. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time the rider vanished beyond the rise, leaving behind nothing but a faint trail of dust that the wind quickly erased, as if the land itself preferred not to hold on to questions longer than necessary. Ethan remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against the fence post, the other unconsciously pressing against the inside of his coat where the wrapped object sat, quiet and unmoving, yet impossible to ignore. The words echoed again, not loud, not demanding, but steady in a way that refused to fade. It will not stay with you. He exhaled slowly, shifting his weight, eyes drifting across the open stretch of land that had always felt like something he understood. But understanding, he was beginning to realize, had less to do with what a man knew and more to do with what he was willing to see when no one was there to guide him. The afternoon passed without hurry, the light turning warmer, stretching shadows across the ground in long lines that made everything appear both closer and farther at the same time. Ethan moved through his routine out of habit rather than need, checking the water trough, running a hand along the fence line, stepping into the barn and back out again, each action familiar, each one now carrying a quiet layer of awareness he had never noticed before. The world had not changed. He had, and that difference made everything else feel slightly out of place. When he finally returned to the house, the sky had softened into that pale gold that came just before evening, the kind of light that made even the smallest details stand out. He paused at the doorway, hand resting against the frame, then reached into his coat and drew out the wrapped object once more. This time, he did not hesitate. He sat at the table, the wood cool beneath his forearms, and carefully unfolded the cloth, revealing the small piece of silver again. It caught the fading light in a muted way, not shining, not drawing attention, just existing, as if it had no need to prove anything to anyone. Ethan leaned closer, studying the markings etched into its surface, lines and symbols that meant nothing to him, and yet felt deliberate, like a language that did not rely on words. He turned it slightly, watching how the light moved across it, how it seemed to change without actually changing at all. Shows whether you can carry it, he murmured, repeating the words as if saying them aloud might make them clearer. But they did not. Not yet. Outside, the wind shifted again, a cooler edge now, carrying the first hint of night. Ethan sat back, the chair creaking softly beneath him, and held the silver between his fingers, not gripping it, not claiming it, just holding it long enough to feel its presence. Then, slowly, he closed his hand around it. Not tight, just enough. The room seemed quieter then, as if something had settled into place, though he could not say what. He remained like that for a moment, still, listening to the silence, to the faint sounds of the land beyond the walls, to the steady rhythm of his own breath. Nothing changed. And yet, something did. Ethan opened his hand again and looked down. The silver was still there, unmoved, unaltered. But the feeling in his chest had shifted, just slightly, like a door that had not fully opened, but no longer remained closed. He wrapped the cloth around it once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and placed it on the table instead of returning it to his coat. It did not belong hidden. Not yet. He stood and stepped back toward the doorway, looking out across the land as the last of the light stretched thin along the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond what he could see, were people who would never measure a man by the same rules he had lived by his entire life. And for the first time, that did not feel like a threat. It felt like a question, one he had not yet answered, one he was not sure he was ready to answer. But he knew this much. The next time that question came, it would not be asked with words, and it would not wait for him to be ready. The night came quietly, not all at once, but in layers that settled over the land like something patient, something that did not rush because it did not need to. Ethan remained by the doorway longer than he realized, watching the last line of light fade into a thin band along the horizon before it disappeared completely, leaving the sky open and dark above him. The air had cooled enough to carry a sharper edge, brushing against his face, pulling him fully into the present moment whether he was ready or not. Inside, the small piece of silver rested on the table where he had left it, catching the faint glow of the lantern in a way that did not demand attention, but never allowed itself to be forgotten. He stepped back in, closing the door behind him with a soft push, the sound settling into the stillness of the room like the final word in a conversation that had not yet finished. For a while, he did nothing, just stood there, listening. The quiet inside the house was different from the quiet outside. Outside, it stretched. Inside, it waited. Ethan walked to the table again, slower this time, and looked down at the cloth-wrapped object as if expecting it to have changed in his absence. It had not. That was the point. Truth did not shift to meet a man. A man had to shift to meet it. He pulled the chair out and sat, elbows resting lightly on the wood, fingers tapping once against the surface before going still. His gaze drifted to the window, where the reflection of the lantern flickered faintly against the glass, overlapping with the darkness beyond, blurring the line between what was inside and what was out there waiting. The thought came without warning. Not a memory, not a voice, just a realization that settled into place as if it had always been there. The test had not happened by the river. It had started there. It had followed him back. And now it was here, sitting across from him without shape, without form, asking nothing and expecting everything. Ethan reached out and unwrapped the cloth again, slower than before, as if the act itself carried weight. The silver lay in his palm once more, cool, steady, unchanged. He turned it slightly, watching how the lantern light traced the markings, how each line seemed to hold its place no matter how the angle shifted. "What remains?" he said under his breath, the words from the older man returning, clearer now in the stillness. He closed his fingers around it again, this time not to feel its weight, but to hold it long enough to notice something else. Not in the object, in himself. The room did not change. The air did not shift, but something inside him settled, just enough to be felt. Not certainty, not yet, but direction. A sound broke the stillness then, faint, almost lost beneath the wind. Not hoofs this time, not voices, just a single knock. Soft, measured, once. Ethan's head lifted immediately, his body already moving before his mind could catch up. He stood, the chair scraping lightly behind him, and crossed the room in 3 steady steps. He paused at the door, hand hovering near the handle, not out of fear, but out of awareness that whatever waited on the other side was not there by chance. The knock came again. Same rhythm, same quiet certainty. Ethan opened the door slowly. The night stretched out before him, dark and wide, the stars just beginning to settle into place overhead. For a moment, there was no one there, just the open land and the wind moving across it. Then he looked down. At the base of the porch, half in shadow, something rested against the step. Not placed carelessly, not dropped, set there with intention. Ethan stepped forward, crouching slightly, his hand reaching out but stopping just short of touching it. A small bundle, wrapped in leather this time, tied with a thin strip of cord that had been pulled tight, then loosened just enough to be opened without force. He picked it up carefully, feeling its weight, different from the silver, heavier, but not in a way that felt threatening. He straightened slowly, turning it once in his hands, eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the mark pressed into the leather, faint but deliberate. Not a symbol he recognized, but not meant for him to recognize. Not yet. Ethan stood there in the doorway, the night stretching out beyond him, the bundle in his hands, and the silver resting in his pocket once more, the two objects now connected by something he could not name. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back inside, closing the door with quiet care, and set the new bundle beside the silver on the table. Two pieces, two questions, one path between them. And for the first time since the river, Ethan understood that the test was not about a single moment. It was about what a man did when the moment passed and the world stopped watching. The two objects sat side by side on the table, catching the lantern light in different ways. One quiet and familiar now, the other heavier with a silence that felt less patient, more expectant, as if it had arrived with purpose instead of possibility. Ethan stood over them for a long moment without moving, his shadow stretching across the wood, his breath steady but slower than before, measured in a way that came from knowing the next step mattered more than the last. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the walls, a steady reminder that the world did not pause for a man to understand it. It simply continued, whether he kept up or not. Ethan reached for the leather bundle first, not out of preference, but because it was the unknown, and the unknown demanded attention in a way the familiar did not. His fingers worked the cord loose slowly, careful not to pull too hard, not to rush what had clearly been prepared with intention. The leather unfolded in layers, each one revealing just enough to keep him moving forward without giving everything away at once. Inside, wrapped again in a thinner piece of cloth, lay something darker, not metal this time, not reflective, but solid in a different way. Ethan lifted it gently, feeling the weight settle into his palm, heavier than the silver, shaped unevenly, like something carved by hand rather than formed by tools. He unwrapped the final layer. A small stone, smooth on one side, rough on the other, marked with a single line that ran through its center, not straight, not curved, but deliberate, as if it had been placed there to divide something that once belonged together. Ethan turned it slightly, watching how the lantern light touched it, how it refused to shine, refused to reflect, absorbing the light instead of returning it. One shows, he said quietly, glancing toward the silver, then back to the stone. The other holds. The words came without thought, settling into place like something remembered rather than created. He set the stone down beside the silver and stepped back half a pace, studying them together now, not as separate pieces, but as parts of the same question. Truth and what remained. The knock had not come again. No footsteps. No sign of who had left it. But Ethan understood now that he was not meant to know. Not yet. The test was not about who delivered it. It was about what he did with it once it was in his hands. He moved to the window, resting one hand against the frame, eyes scanning the dark stretch of land beyond, searching not for movement, but for meaning. Nothing answered. The stars had settled fully now, scattered across the sky in a way that made the land feel both endless and small at the same time. Ethan turned back to the table slowly, his gaze settling on the two objects again, and for the first time since they had entered his life, he did not see them as something separate from himself. They were not questions anymore. They were measures. He reached out, picked up the silver in one hand, the stone in the other, and held them both for a moment, feeling the difference between them, the contrast, the balance. Then he did something small, something simple. He carried them both to the shelf near the door, not hiding them, not displaying them, just placing them where they would be seen every time he stepped in or out, every time he crossed that threshold between the world he knew and the one he was learning to understand. He stepped back, arms at his sides, and looked at them there, silent, unchanged, waiting. What remains, he repeated, quieter now, not as a question, but as something closer to a promise. Outside, the wind shifted again, softer this time, carrying something faint, something almost like a Voice if a man chose to hear it that way. Ethan did not move toward the door. He did not call out. He simply stood there, steady, aware, knowing that whatever came next would not announce itself the way danger did. It would arrive quietly. It would wait, and it would reveal more about him than he might be ready to see. He reached up once more, not to take the objects down, but to adjust them slightly, aligning the silver and the stone so the line etched into one faced the markings on the other, not perfectly matched, but close enough to suggest they were meant to be understood together. Then he lowered his hand and stepped away, leaving them there, not as answers, but as something that would not let him forget the question. Morning did not arrive all at once. It eased in through the thin line at the edge of the horizon, turning the darkness into a pale gray that slowly revealed the shape of the land again. The fence, the barn, the quiet outline of the house that had stood unchanged for years. Ethan was already awake before the light fully reached the porch, sitting at the table with his hands resting flat against the wood, not thinking, not planning, just present in a way that felt different from every other morning he had known. The silver and the stone remained on the shelf near the door, untouched, exactly where he had placed them, but their presence had already shaped the space around them. He did not look at them immediately. He did not need to. He felt them the same way he felt the weight of the land outside, steady, constant, waiting without asking. The sound of the wind had softened overnight, replaced by a quieter rhythm, one that carried the distant movement of the plains waking up. A faint rustle, a bird somewhere beyond the fence. Nothing that demanded attention. Only things that existed whether a man noticed them or not. Ethan pushed himself up from the chair slowly, the wood scraping lightly against the floor, and walked toward the door, stopping just short of stepping outside. His gaze lifted to the shelf. The silver caught the first line of sunlight, not shining, but reflecting just enough to remind him it was there. The stone remained darker, absorbing the light, unchanged by it. He reached up, not hesitating this time, and took them both into his hands again, one in each, feeling the contrast, the balance, the question they carried without words. "What remains?" he said quietly, not as a question anymore, but as something closer to a guide. He stepped outside, the cool air meeting him fully now, sharper than the night, cleaner, carrying the scent of earth warming under the rising sun. The land stretched wide in front of him, unchanged, but no longer distant. It felt closer now, not in miles, but in meaning. Ethan walked a few steps away from the porch and stopped near the fence line. The same place he had stood the day before, but not the same man standing there. He looked out across the horizon, eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something, though he did not know what. Then he saw it. Not movement, not a figure, just a faint line in the distance where the ground shifted slightly, where the land rose and fell in a way that marked the direction of the canyon. The place where everything had started. The place where something had not ended. He lowered his gaze to the objects in his hands, then back to the horizon, and for a moment, the choice settled into place without needing to be forced. Not because he had to go, but because staying would leave the question unanswered. He walked back toward the barn, his pace steady, not rushed, not uncertain, simply moving forward. Inside, he saddled his horse with the same quiet care he always had, but each motion carried a clearer intent now. Each movement connected to something beyond routine. The leather straps tightened. The reins checked. The weight balanced. Nothing new. Everything different. When he led the horse out into the open light again, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows behind him, stretching his shape across the ground in a way that made it look like he was leaving something behind even before he began to move. He paused once more by the porch, his eyes lifting to the shelf where the objects had rested, then lowering to his hands where they now belonged. He did not put them away. He did not hide them. He slipped the silver into his coat, close enough to feel its presence with every step, and tied the stone carefully to the saddle, not as a burden, but as something that would move with him, something that would remain in sight no matter where he looked. Ethan mounted without hesitation, settling into the saddle with a familiarity that had never felt uncertain before and now carried something deeper than habit. He turned the horse toward the open land, toward the faint line that marked the path back to the canyon, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to sit still, to feel the weight of the decision not as pressure, but as direction. Then he nudged the horse forward. The first steps were slow, deliberate, the ground firm beneath the hooves, the air clear, the path open. No one watched. No one called out. No one needed to. Because this was not about being seen. It was about what remained when no one was there to decide for him. And as Ethan Cole rode toward the place where everything had begun, he understood that whatever waited ahead would not test what he had done before. It would test what he chose to become now. The land stretched wider the closer Ethan rode toward the canyon, not because the distance changed, but because his sense of it had. The same hills, the same broken lines of rock, the same narrow path cutting through it all, yet nothing felt as simple as it had the day before. His horse moved at a steady pace, hooves striking the ground with a rhythm that matched the quiet focus settling into his chest, each step carrying him deeper into a place that no longer felt like something to pass through, but something to understand. The sun had climbed higher now, the light sharper, revealing every detail of the terrain, every shadow cast by stone and brush, nothing hidden, nothing softened. Ethan kept his eyes forward, not searching, not expecting, just moving with the same deliberate calm he had chosen the moment he left the ranch. The silver rested against his chest beneath his coat, a steady presence, not warm, not cold, just there, reminding him without effort. The stone hung from the saddle, shifting slightly with each movement, catching his eye now and then, not asking to be understood, only to be carried. As the canyon walls began to rise around him again, narrowing the open space into something more defined, the air changed. Cooler, quieter. The wind did not reach as easily here. Sound traveled differently. Ethan slowed his horse without thinking, letting the animal pick its way over the uneven ground, his body adjusting naturally to the terrain, but his mind sharper now, aware in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with presence. He reached the edge of the riverbank and stopped. The water had calmed since the storm, no longer a force that demanded attention, but still moving, still steady, still carrying whatever it chose to take. Ethan dismounted slowly, boots touching the damp earth, and stood there for a moment, looking at the place where everything had shifted. Nothing marked it. No sign. No trace. The land did not remember the moment the way he did. That, more than anything, felt important. He stepped closer to the water, his reflection faint and broken in the current, shifting with each ripple. Not clear, not stable, but still there. He reached into his coat and took out the silver, holding it loosely in his hand, watching how the light moved across it in the open air, different from how it had looked inside the house. Then he glanced down at the stone tied to the saddle, and for a brief second, the two felt connected in a way he could not yet explain. "What remains?" he said again, quieter now, not to the land, not to himself, just letting the words exist. The sound of movement reached him then, not sudden, not hidden, just present. Ethan did not turn immediately. He let the moment settle first, let the awareness come fully before he shifted his gaze toward the ridge. Ayanna stood there, not close, not distant, her posture steady, her presence as natural to the canyon as the stone beneath her feet. She had not approached. She had not called out. She simply stood, watching, as if she had known he would return, as if this moment had been waiting as much as he had. Ethan did not step toward her. He did not raise a hand. He only turned enough to face her, the silver still in his palm, the river. Behind him, the canyon around them holding the space between two worlds that had crossed once and had not yet decided what that crossing meant. For a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet stretched, but it did not feel empty. It felt full, like something building without needing to be rushed. Ayanna's gaze moved briefly to the silver, then to the stone at his saddle, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not approval, just recognition. "You came back," she said, her voice carrying easily across the space, calm, steady, as if the words had been waiting as long as he had. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate. "I did not leave everything behind," he replied. Ayanna studied him for a moment longer, her eyes reading something deeper than his words, something that did not need to be explained. Then she stepped down from the ridge, her movements unhurried, certain, closing the distance not with urgency, but with intention. The canyon did not react. The river did not change, but the space between them did. Not smaller, not larger, just clearer. And as she approached, Ethan understood that this was not the same moment returning. This was something else. Something that would not be decided by what he had done before, but by what he chose now, standing there with the truth in his hand and the question still unanswered. The distance between them closed slowly, not measured in steps, but in understanding, each moment settling into place without needing to be forced. Ayanna stopped a few feet away, not crossing into his space, not asking him to step into hers, simply standing where the ground held her, where the river's quiet movement could still be heard between them. Ethan did not move either. He let the stillness remain, let it shape the moment the way it needed to, his hand relaxed at his side, the silver resting loosely in his palm, no longer something he clung to, but something he carried. Ayanna's gaze moved once more, from his face to the silver, then briefly to the stone tied at his saddle, and back again, as if reading not the objects themselves, but what they had done to him. "You understand more now," she said, not as a question, but as something observed. Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes shifting toward the river for a brief second before returning to her. "I understand that I did not understand," he replied, his voice steady, not defensive, not proud, just clear. Ayanna gave a small nod, not in approval, but in recognition of something that did not need to be explained further. The wind moved lightly through the canyon, brushing past them, carrying no urgency, no tension, only the quiet presence of a place that had seen many moments like this and had never needed to hold on to them. Ethan lifted the silver slightly, just enough to look at it again in the open light, then lowered it, his gaze steady. "This," he said, "it does not speak. It does not prove anything." Ayanna's expression remained calm. "It was never meant to," she answered. Ethan nodded once, the realization settling deeper now. "It shows what I am willing to carry," he continued. Ayanna watched him for a moment longer, then took a single step closer, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough to shift it. "And the stone?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the saddle, then back at her. "It does not show anything," he said. "It stays." Ayanna's eyes held his, steady, unbroken. "That is what remains," she said quietly. The words settled into the canyon like something final, not loud, not dramatic, but complete in a way that left no need for anything more. Ethan felt it then, not as a sudden change, but as something that had been building since the river, now finally finding its place. He looked down at the silver in his hand, then slowly closed his fingers around it, not to hold it tighter, but to acknowledge it. Then he did something simple. He walked past her, not away, not toward anything visible, just forward, following the line of the river, his steps steady, unhurried, as if the direction no longer needed to be questioned. Ayanna did not stop him. She turned slightly, watching him move, her gaze not fixed on his back, but on the way he carried himself, the way his steps no longer hesitated, no longer searched for permission. After a few paces, Ethan stopped and turned back, not fully, just enough to meet her eyes again. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he reached into his coat and took out the silver, holding it up slightly, not offering it, not returning it, just showing it. "It stays," he said. Ayanna held his gaze, then gave a single nod, small, almost imperceptible, but enough. Enough to say the test was no longer about the object. Enough to say it had never been. Ethan lowered his hand, slipping the silver back into his coat, and turned forward again, continuing along the river's path. The canyon did not react. The water did not change. But something had shifted, not in the land, not in the objects, but in the man who carried them. And as the distance between them grew once more, not in separation, but in direction, Ayanna remained where she stood, watching until he was no longer just a figure moving through the canyon, but part of it, part of the same quiet truth that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The river carried on as it always had, steady and unbothered by the weight men placed on moments that passed through it, and Ethan walked beside it without trying to match its pace, letting his steps fall where they needed to, not where he thought they should. The canyon walls stretched high on either side, holding the space in a quiet way, not trapping, not guiding, simply existing as they had long before he arrived and long after he would leave. The silver rested against his chest, no longer something he checked, no longer something he questioned, just present in the same way his breath was present, constant and unspoken. The stone moved gently with the saddle behind him, its weight no longer noticeable unless he chose to think about it. And even then, it did not press, it did not demand, it simply remained. That was the difference now. Nothing demanded anything from him. Not the land, not the objects, not even the memory of what had happened. And yet, everything mattered more. He stopped after a while, not because he had reached a destination, but because the moment asked him to. The river curved slightly ahead, bending out of sight, the water catching the light in small, shifting patterns that never stayed the same for more than a second. Ethan looked at it, then at the ground beneath his boots, then at the open stretch beyond the canyon where the land would widen again. There was no marker, no line to cross, no voice to tell him he had arrived. That, he understood now, was the point. He reached into his coat and took out the silver once more, holding it in his palm, not to examine it, not to question it, but simply to acknowledge it one last time as something separate from himself. The markings on its surface did not change. They did not need to. He closed his hand around it, then opened it again, slower this time, as if letting go of the need to understand what it meant and accepting what it had already shown him. Then he did something simple. He did not put it back in his coat. He did not hide it. He slipped the cord from around the stone at his saddle and held both objects together in his hands, feeling their difference, their balance, their quiet agreement. One showed, one remained, and somewhere between them, a man chose. Ethan stepped closer to the edge of the river, not far enough to risk his footing, just enough to let the sound fill the space around him. He knelt slowly, the ground cool beneath his knee, and placed the stone down first, right at the edge where water met earth, where it would stay until the river decided otherwise. Then he looked at the silver one more time, the light catching it in a way that no longer felt separate from him, and after a brief moment, he placed it beside the stone. Not into the water, not away from it, just there, where both could exist without needing to be carried any further. He stood again, brushing the dust from his hands, and stepped back without hesitation. There was no ceremony, no final word, nothing to mark the moment except the quiet understanding that some things were not meant to be held forever. They were meant to be carried until they were no longer needed. Ethan turned from the river and walked back toward his horse, his steps steady, his posture unchanged, but something in the way he moved had settled into place in a way that did not shift with thought or doubt. He mounted without looking back, not because the moment did not matter, but because it no longer needed his attention to remain true. The canyon opened slowly as he rode, the walls lowering, the sky widening above him, the land stretching out once more into that endless space he had known his entire life. But now, it felt different in the simplest way possible. It did not need to be explained. It did not need to be proven. It simply was. And so was he. Somewhere behind him, the river continued, the stone remained, the silver caught the light when it chose to, and nothing about them changed. But Ethan Cole no longer needed them to. Because out here, where no one watched, where no one judged, where no one decided for him what a moment meant, he had already answered the only question that mattered. Not with words, not with proof, but with the quiet choice to walk away without needing to carry anything except the man he had become. And in that silence, deeper than any sound the canyon had ever held, justice did not arrive like a storm or a verdict. It arrived the only way it ever truly did, without a sound, and it stayed.